It looked like a suicide. That's what everyone believed at first. A man alone in his car, engine still running, a fatal gunshot wound to the head. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, no immediate reason to question what seemed on the surface tragically straightforward. Cases like this move quickly, processed, documented, and closed. Another life lost, another quiet conclusion. But this one didn't sit right. On the morning of June 15, 2025, deputies were dispatched to a residential area in New Caney, Texas, after a report came in about an unresponsive man inside a vehicle. When law enforcement arrived, they found him exactly where the caller described, slumped inside, motionless. The vehicle hadn't been turned off. The scene was eerily still, almost staged in its silence. The victim was identified as 33-year-old Lonnie Moore. At first glance, everything pointed toward suicide. The position of the body, the presence of a firearm, and the lack of visible external disturbance aligned with what investigators often see in self-inflicted gunshot cases. But experienced detectives know better than to rely on appearances alone. Scenes can be deceiving, and sometimes the smallest inconsistency is enough to unravel an entire narrative. The early assessment didn't trigger immediate alarm, but it also didn't close the door. Standard protocol demanded a closer look, especially in a case involving a firearm and no eyewitnesses. The vehicle became the first silent witness. Every detail inside it mattered: the angle of the wound, the distribution of blood, the placement of the weapon. Each element had to be examined, measured, and compared against known forensic patterns. And slowly, the first cracks began to appear. Gunshot suicides tend to follow predictable trajectories. The positioning of the weapon, the entry wound, and the resulting blood spatter usually align with a very specific physical sequence. But here, something was off. Subtle, but enough to raise concern among investigators trained to notice what doesn't belong. The trajectory didn't quite match the expected angle of a self-inflicted wound. The blood patterns inside the vehicle raised additional questions, questions that didn't have immediate answers but refused to be ignored. What initially appeared to be a closed case began to shift into something else entirely. As detectives expanded their inquiry, they turned their attention to the victim's personal life. Understanding the circumstances leading up to the death often reveals what the physical evidence cannot. Who was he with? Who did he speak to last? Was there anything unusual about his behavior in the hours before his death? That's when another layer of complexity emerged. Lonnie Moore was not living a quiet, isolated life. He had a family, he had relationships, and most importantly, he had a history that investigators couldn't overlook. He had been separated from his wife for nearly 2 years. The relationship, by multiple accounts, had deteriorated long before that June morning. Separation alone doesn't indicate motive, but it introduces variables: emotional strain, unresolved conflict, financial disputes, custody concerns. In many domestic-related cases, these underlying tensions become critical pieces of the puzzle. Detectives began examining communication records, phone logs, messages, any digital footprint that could establish a timeline leading up to the moment his life ended. Modern investigations rely heavily on this kind of data. Phones don't just connect people, they record patterns, movements, and intent. And what they found would challenge the initial assumption completely. There had been communication shortly before his death. Not random, not insignificant, targeted. Someone had reached out to him, drawing him out that morning. The nature of that contact wasn't immediately clear, but its timing was impossible to ignore. He hadn't just ended up in that location by chance. He had been called there. That single realization changed the direction of the investigation. This was no longer about determining whether a man had taken his own life. It became about understanding why he was in that specific place, at that specific time, and who knew he would be there. The case was no longer passive. It was active. Investigators began reconstructing the timeline with greater precision. Where had he been before arriving at that location? Who knew his movements? Who had the opportunity to intersect with him during that window? Surveillance technology became the next critical tool. In areas where traditional witnesses are absent, cameras often fill the gap. Traffic systems, neighborhood security setups, automated license plate readers, each one capturing fragments of reality, piecing together a story that no one person saw in full. And somewhere within those digital eyes, there was movement. Footage began to surface, images of a vehicle, movements that aligned too closely with the timeline to be dismissed. Not clear enough to tell the whole story, but enough to suggest that Lonnie Moore had not been alone in the way investigators first believed. The idea of a second person introduced a new dimension entirely. Because if someone else was present, then the possibility of suicide became increasingly unlikely. At the same time, detectives revisited the physical evidence with this new perspective. The interior of the vehicle was reanalyzed. The position of the victim, the distribution of biological material, the orientation of the firearm. Everything was now viewed through a different lens, not as confirmation of suicide, but as potential indicators of homicide. And the inconsistencies grew louder. The more they looked, the less it made sense as a self-inflicted act. Behind the scenes, interviews were conducted. People close to Lonnie were questioned. Friends, relatives, acquaintances, anyone who could provide insight into his state of mind or recent interactions. Investigators weren't just looking for motive. They were looking for contradiction. And they found it. There was no clear indication that he intended to end his life. No documented history suggesting immediate risk. No final messages, no preparations, no behavioral indicators commonly associated with suicide cases. Instead, what emerged was a pattern of ongoing tension, unresolved issues, and communication that pointed outward, not inward. Someone else was part of this story, but who and why remained unanswered. What started as a routine death investigation had now transformed into a developing homicide case. Quietly, methodically, detectives shifted their approach. Evidence was no longer being reviewed to confirm a conclusion. It was being collected to build one. And as each piece fell into place, one truth became unavoidable. Lonnie Moore didn't die alone. And whatever happened inside that vehicle that morning was far from what it first appeared to be. The scene had been staged, but not perfectly, not enough to fool the evidence, and certainly not enough to stop what was coming next. By the time investigators accepted that the scene had been staged, the case had already entered a different phase, one that required patience, precision, and restraint. Homicide investigations built on deception are rarely solved quickly. Every movement, every statement, every piece of digital evidence had to be verified, cross-checked, and placed within a timeline that could withstand scrutiny in court. The first major shift came from technology. Detectives began pulling data from multiple sources: cell tower pings, call detail records, and surveillance systems operating throughout Montgomery County. Unlike eyewitnesses, these systems don't forget, don't misinterpret, and don't change their stories. They record what happens, exactly when it happens. And in cases like this, that objectivity becomes critical. The phone records told a story that Lonnie Moore never had the chance to explain. Shortly before his death, he had been contacted, not by chance, not through routine communication, but through a number that immediately stood out to investigators. It wasn't associated with any known contact in his phone. It wasn't part of his regular call pattern. It was new, isolated, and temporary. A prepaid device. What investigators would later identify as a burner phone. Burner phones are not inherently illegal, but in criminal investigations, they often signal intent. an effort to communicate without leaving a traceable identity. When used in proximity to a violent crime, they rarely point to coincidence. The number had been used to reach Lonnie that morning. It had drawn him out, placed him in motion, and ultimately guided him to the exact location where he was later found dead. That detail alone changed the structure of the case, because it meant the meeting was planned. And more importantly, it meant someone had taken steps to conceal their involvement. Detectives began tracing the origin of the burner phone. Purchases like these can sometimes be difficult to track, especially when paid for in cash. But even then, there are often indirect connections: surveillance footage at the point of sale, patterns of movement, or individuals linked to the transaction. What they uncovered added another layer. The phone had not been purchased by Lonnie. It had not been purchased under his name. Instead, it was linked to someone within the broader social circle connected to his estranged wife, Breyanai Moore. At that point, her name was no longer just part of the background. She became central to the investigation. Breyanai Moore had already been identified as someone with a direct connection to the victim. Their marriage had been unstable for years, and by June 2025, they had been living separately for an extended period. That alone didn't implicate her in a crime, but when layered with the emerging evidence, it demanded closer examination. Investigators turned their focus toward her movements on the day of the incident. Her initial statement placed her at home with their young daughter. It was a clear, simple alibi, one that, if verified, would significantly distance her from the scene. But simple alibis are only as strong as the evidence supporting them. And in this case, that evidence began to fall apart. Surveillance footage captured in the area around the crime scene showed a vehicle and an individual moving within a time frame that aligned almost perfectly with the estimated time of death. The footage wasn't immediately definitive. It rarely is, but it provided enough visual data to warrant further analysis. Frame by frame, investigators studied the movement, the clothing, the posture, the timing, and then came a critical moment in the investigation: identification. According to statements later gathered during the case, even individuals close to Breyanai Moore acknowledged that the person seen in the footage resembled her. Among them was her own mother, who reportedly confirmed that the individual captured on camera was, in fact, Breyanai. That confirmation didn't close the case, but it significantly narrowed the gap between suspicion and evidence. At the same time, digital forensics continued to build pressure. Location data extracted from mobile devices placed Breyanai Moore in proximity to the area where Lonnie was found, directly contradicting her initial claim of being at home. Unlike human memory, location data operates on precise timestamps. It doesn't rely on interpretation. It establishes presence. And presence in a case like this is everything. Investigators now had multiple threads pointing in the same direction: a burner phone used to contact the victim, surveillance footage placing a person resembling the suspect near the scene, and phone data contradicting her alibi. But one piece was still missing: direct connection to the act itself. That piece came through testimony. During the course of the investigation, a witness came forward, someone who had spoken directly with Breyanai Moore after the incident. What they reported added a level of detail that investigators had not yet been able to confirm through physical evidence alone. According to that statement, the encounter inside the vehicle had been orchestrated. Lonnie had been lured under the pretense of a meeting, one that he had no reason to perceive as dangerous. When he arrived, the situation unfolded in a way that removed his ability to respond. The positioning inside the vehicle placed him at a disadvantage. And then a single gunshot. From behind. If accurate, that account explained what the forensic evidence had been suggesting from the beginning: the trajectory of the wound, the distribution of blood, the overall configuration of the scene. It aligned with a homicide, not a suicide. Still, investigators treated the statement with caution. Testimony must be corroborated. It must align with physical evidence, digital records, and the established timeline. In this case, it did. The backseat positioning described in the statement corresponded with the inconsistencies observed in the original forensic analysis. The timing matched the communication records. The presence at the scene was supported by both surveillance and location data. Individually, each piece raised suspicion. Together, they formed a pattern that pointed toward premeditation. The idea that this was a spontaneous act became increasingly difficult to support. The use of a burner phone, the deliberate communication, the coordination of location, all of it suggested planning. Not impulsive violence, but calculated action. And that distinction matters. Because in the legal system, premeditation elevates the severity of the charge. It transforms the narrative from an isolated incident into a deliberate act of intent. As the case progressed, investigators began assembling their findings into a cohesive structure, one that could be presented to a judge, reviewed by prosecutors, and ultimately tested in court. Every detail had to be documented. Every conclusion had to be supported. There was no room for assumption. Only evidence. After months of analysis, interviews, and reconstruction, the case reached a point where the accumulated evidence was no longer circumstantial in nature. It had weight, it had direction, and it had a clear focal point. The initial ruling of suicide had been completely overturned. In its place stood a homicide investigation supported by forensic analysis, digital tracking, surveillance identification, and witness testimony. The question was no longer what happened. It was when the system would act on it. And after nearly 9 months of quiet, methodical work behind the scenes, that moment was approaching. Because once the evidence reaches a certain threshold, the investigation doesn't just continue. It moves. And when it does, it moves fast. By early March 2026, the investigation had reached its breaking point, the stage where evidence stops being collected and starts being acted upon. For nearly 9 months, detectives had worked the case from every angle, reconstructing a death that was initially written off as self-inflicted. What they had now was no longer a theory. It was a fully developed homicide case supported by forensic analysis, digital tracking, surveillance correlation, and witness
testimony. Looked like
testimony.
a suicide, but detectives
All that
kept
remained
working.
was
according to court
execution.
records, the woman's own mother
On March
told
4,
police the
2026,
guilt appeared to be
law
eating at her
enforcement
daughter,
moved
who
in.
lost weight and was crying a
Breyanai
lot.
Moore was
The
taken
victim's
into
body
custody
discovered with a
without
single
incident.
gunshot wound in an
The
SUV
arrest
in New
marked the
Caney.
first
ABC
public
13 Sarah Al
confirmation
Sheikh
that
there
the case
tonight
had shifted
with how police
entirely from
connected all the
suicide
dots.
to
Sarah.
murder. What had once appeared to be a closed file was now an active criminal prosecution. The quiet transformation of the investigation was over. From that moment forward, everything would unfold under the weight of the justice system. She was booked into the Montgomery County Jail and formally charged with murder in connection with the death of her husband, Lonnie Moore. The decision to charge wasn't based on a single piece of evidence. It was the result of accumulation, multiple independent elements aligning to form a consistent narrative. The burner phone, the surveillance footage, the contradictory alibi, the location data, and the witness statement all pointed in the same direction. None of it existed in isolation anymore. It was a case, and it was strong enough to move forward. In court proceedings that followed the arrest, Breyanai Moore was held without bond. That decision reflected the seriousness of the charge and the weight of the evidence presented during the initial hearings. In cases involving alleged premeditated violence, especially those supported by multiple forms of corroboration, judges often err on the side of caution. The risk factors, flight, interference with witnesses, or further harm, are taken into account. The prosecution's position was clear from the outset. They argued that Lonnie Moore had been deliberately lured to the location where he was killed, that the use of a burner phone demonstrated an attempt to conceal identity and avoid detection, that the positioning inside the vehicle indicated he had been placed at a tactical disadvantage, and that the subsequent staging of the scene as a suicide was an effort to mislead investigators and delay accountability. Each of those claims was tied directly to evidence already documented during the investigation. The defense at that stage had not yet presented a full counter-narrative. Early proceedings in a case like this are rarely about proving innocence or guilt. They are about establishing process, ensuring that the arrest was lawful, that the charges are supported by probable cause, and that the case can proceed through the system without procedural violations. Behind the legal arguments, however, the facts remained unchanged. Lonnie Moore had been found alone in a running vehicle with a fatal gunshot wound to the head. The scene had initially suggested suicide, but every layer of investigation had pulled that assumption apart. The forensic inconsistencies raised the first doubts. The digital evidence introduced direction. The surveillance footage placed a presence. The witness testimony provided context, and together they reconstructed a sequence that no longer aligned with self-infliction. Instead, it pointed to controlled circumstances. A planned meeting. A confined space. A single, fatal act carried out from a position the victim could not anticipate. And then, an attempt to make it look like something it was. Cases involving staged scenes often rely on one critical assumption, that the initial interpretation will hold, that once a death is categorized in a certain way, it will not be questioned deeply enough to uncover what lies beneath. But that assumption failed here. Because the details didn't cooperate. The trajectory didn't match. The blood evidence didn't align. The timeline didn't make sense. And the technology, silent, constant, and precise, filled in the gaps that the staging tried to hide. As the case moved forward through the legal system, it entered a phase where public information became more limited. Court proceedings, motions, and evidentiary reviews are often conducted with restrictions, especially in ongoing criminal cases. What had been revealed during the investigation formed the foundation, but the final outcome would depend on how that evidence was presented, challenged, and interpreted in court. At the time of the arrest and initial hearings, no final verdict had been reached. No plea had been formally entered into the public record. The case remained active. What was established, however, was the transformation. A death that began as an apparent suicide had been reclassified as a homicide after months of investigation. A narrative that once seemed complete had been dismantled piece by piece, and a suspect, initially positioned outside the immediate scope of suspicion, had been brought to the center of the case through evidence, not assumption. For investigators, the conclusion of this phase marked the end of one process and the beginning of another. Their role, to uncover, document, and present, had been fulfilled to the point required for prosecution. What followed would now unfold within the courtroom, where evidence is not just collected, but contested. For the victim, Lonnie Moore, the shift in classification meant something else entirely. It meant that his death was no longer being treated as a solitary act. It meant that the questions surrounding that morning, why he was there, who contacted him, what really happened inside that vehicle, had been acknowledged, investigated, and answered to the extent that the evidence allowed. And for everyone watching from the outside, the case stood as a reminder of how easily appearances can mislead. A quiet scene, a single gunshot, a conclusion that seemed obvious. Until it was. Because in the end, it wasn't the scene that told the story. It was the evidence. And the evidence didn't lie.